I'm very excited to be here. I understand you have had a very long and fabulous day. So I'm going to try and end on a energizing note. We'll see how it goes. I was actually talking a little bit with Molly Kelly today, and this talk, my being here, has been in the works, I think, since 2013. So I'm very excited to actually be here. So why would you have a lexicographer, a person who writes dictionaries, keynote at a conference on English education? Excellent question. The thing is as teachers, you and I have something very similar. We really look at the English language very hard. We break it down and try and explain it very clearly to people who are learning English as a foreign language. And that sort of engagement with language is really an important thing that we bring to the table, that nobody else can really bring to the table. And it's something that our students really respond to as well. So I want to talk a little bit about linguistic identity, particularly of your students, and then I want to talk about how linguistic identity and how we think of the English language can shape how we give our students confidence. Because we know that America puts a huge amount of pressure on ELLs to acculturate and to sound as much like an American as they can. The thing is that their linguistic identity actually puts them in a position of power. And so I want to approach this from a position of we're going to empower our students in spaces where they are usually depressed. And the way I can do that is not by giving you classroom tips or anything like that, but by talking about how English is made, what English actually is, and what we think it is, and how we're wrong oftentimes. So, what's linguistic identity? It's a collection of linguistic markers which other people use to identify us and by which we share parts of our identity with others. What are linguistic markers? What am I talking about? What's a collection of them? How do we use them? How do people use them? I mean, really what we're talking about is kind of, you know, the back of the baseball card, right? An idiolect is how we refer to this formally, and the idiolect of each individual speaker is made up of a whole bunch of different things. So first, it's made up of language. I am a native speaker of English, and I am a native speaker of Western American English in particular. I also am a learner of several foreign languages. I speak all of them very badly. So I feel for a lot of our students who are trying to wrap their heads and their mouths and their hands and their minds around this. But more than that, I'm a native speaker of Western American English because I grew up in Colorado. I also am sort of encultured into the English of the Mid-Atlantic region. I have Appalachian English in my background because my dad's from Appalachia. He says Appalachia, not Appalachia. This was a big deal when I moved out east. Our idiolect, our linguistic identity is also made up of sort of this mishmash of regional words that we use together. So I use howdy and y'all natively. I have family in Texas, that's where I got y'all. I use howdy because my dad uses it. And I use the Philly term John, which is a Philly way of saying thing. Any kind of in-family or in-joke words that we use is part of our idiolect. When I had small children, they loved to run around and yell, "I have a wedgie" in public, and it was embarrassing. So we taught them to call wedgies issues, because it's easier to deal with a 5-year-old, you know, in the store yelling, "I have an issue," and saying, "You take care of your issue yourself." We still call wedgies issues in my house. We don't talk about them much because my kids are adults and now it's embarrassing. But your idiolect is also things you didn't pick up. I lived in New England for 20 years. I did not adopt the slang term wicked. So that's what our idiolect is. Now, how do we talk to our ELLs about their idiolect? Well, first we need to understand that their own idiolect makes them superheroes. So when we affirm someone's identity, their linguistic identity, I threw studies up in case you want to read. That means that our learners have better self-esteem, they adjust easier to a new culture. Adolescents have fewer instances of depression. They have stronger social relationships with their first language speakers. They have a better appreciation for cultural values. They have better nonverbal communication skills compared to monolingual native speakers because they have to be attuned to these things. They have to be attuned to how inflection is different in English than it is in their native language. And they have better meta-linguistic awareness than monolingual native speakers. Now that just means that they're really good at saying, so for instance, a Spanish speaker can say the English word tomato looks a whole lot like the Spanish word tomate, and they must be related. So they're putting these pieces together that a monolingual native speaker can't because they don't have that kind of awareness. And yet, our culture just bombards us and our students with sort of this big buffet style plate of English naysaying. So we tell our students that English is hard and English grammar is hard and no one can use it right. And then we have a, side salad of weird, bad science and pseudoscience about the ties between language use and cognition and how if you can't use language articulately, you can't think well. And then you just smother the whole plate with this kind of lumpy gravy of xenophobia that we hear all the time. Why can't they just learn English? Why can't they do it the way that past immigrants learned it? And you eat that entire plate of junk and you have existential indigestion. So, how do we counter this? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us through 6 myths of the English language. I'm going to bust them, and then we're going to talk very briefly at the end about how you can incorporate them into your teaching, into your policy, to help encourage and empower our students to be the linguistic superheroes that they actually are. So, let's just dive in. The first myth is that there is one English language. This is hard, right? When people say, what language do you speak? We say, we speak English. And when our students want to learn a language, they say they want to learn English. And that's great, except English is not this sort of monolithic structure that exists outside of us and that sort of is this thing that we access. It is actually more like 200 dialects in a trench coat pretending to be a language. So here we have a map of the Mid-Teesal region, and here is that same map marked up for what we call dialect. Now, what's a dialect? A dialect is sort of a sub-language. It is a subset of a larger language, has its own grammar, has its own vocabulary, it has its own phonology. That's what we mean by accent, how you talk. And each dialect is sort of one chunk. It's shared by a group of speakers. This is a regional dialect map. The major colors are major differentiations in dialect. The blue and red lines and the light blue lines sort of tell you what the subdivisions of the dialect are. The purple line is the pin-pen merger. So if you are south of that, if you're in Missouri or you're in Kansas, you might say pan and pan for pin and pen. I'm from Denver, over way on the left. We don't have pin-pen merger. If you see that mustard colored line at the top, that's sort of the marker of where your vowels start going Canadian. If the further north you go, the more Canadian they are. And then this big cross-hashed section in the middle is where you have quote unquote general American. That means that the speakers in that little area tend to have a dialect that's neither Northern, Western, Southern, or Eastern. Now, this is a mess, as you can tell. This is not easy to read. I can't read it, and this is my job. But the point is that these are just all the regional dialects that are mapped in your region. Dialects are also carved up in all sorts of different ways. You can have what's called a sociolect, which is a type of language that's shared by people of a particular social group. You can have ethnolects, which are dialects that are shared by people who have a shared ethnic or racial background. Dialect is sort of all over the place, but it is the main marker of our linguistic identity. So what does this mean for you and your students? We need to stop telling our students they're doing great at English. We need to point out to them that they're actually learning probably 2, if not 3 or 4 different types of English at once. And each of those types of English are marked by their own grammar, by their own phonology. And so, of course, it's hard. Of course, it's difficult. We also need to tell them, hey, native speakers don't understand each other's dialects either. So we can start by stopping with, we are learning the English language. We are learning a type of English language, which leads to myth number 2. And that is right and wrong English, right? So we have all been raised and encultured to think of there being good English, bad English, grammatical English, ungrammatical English. And there are circumstances with your learners where that is true. So I eat a pancake is grammatically incorrect. It is actually wrong. And you can tell it's actually wrong because it has mostly to do with things that are grammatical. So there's no, we would use an article in there or a determiner. Eated is not the right conjugation. These are the things that are actually grammar. And when you encounter those, you can say, okay, here's the grammar behind these. But, you know, once your students get past a beginning level, once they really are sort of L3, L4 and above, they stop making these kinds of blatantly ungrammatical incorrect mistakes, and they start doing things like this instead. I'm done my homework. Now, I'm done my homework is right for some various meaning of right. How? So, I just told you I grew up in Colorado. I moved down to the Philly region 14 years ago now, and I had a 7-year-old. And a few years after being here, she came home from school, she did something in her room, and she came down, she said, I'm going to Emily's house. And I said, wait, what about your homework? She said, oh, I'm done my homework. And I, being a parent who cares deeply about language, said, no, you're done with your homework. Because I'm done my homework is not grammatically correct. Except it is grammatically correct here. In the Mid-Atlantic and in Canadian English, I'm done my blank, I'm done my homework, I'm done the dishes, I'm done the laundry. That's grammatically correct according to those dialects. So I said, no, you're done with your homework. And she said, being the daughter of a lexicographer, yeah, that's what I said, I'm done my homework. Now, the problem is that I'm done my homework is dialectal. It's not a part of standard English. And it was outside of my own dialect. I didn't recognize I'm done my homework, but it is absolutely correct here. Everybody says it. Teachers say it, doctors say it, the garbage collector says it, everyone says it. The thing is this is what happens with dialect. Dialects have their own grammar. And when we encounter stuff like this, our impulse is to say, what's wrong? It's wrong because I don't recognize it. Now, when your students have issues like this, you need to step back and say, all right, I eated pancake. I'm pretty sure that's not dialectal. I'm done my homework. That seems weird. Instead of saying, well, that's wrong, or that's right, start talking about context. I'm done my homework is not correct in standard English. It's out of context there. But I'm done my homework is totally fine in Canadian English. So if you start running into these sorts of errors with your students, take a step back and say, well, that's interesting. Did you hear someone say that? Did you read that somewhere? Because I would say, and in standard English, we would say, I'm done with my homework. And you might find out that maybe your Iraqi student has a lot of family in Winnipeg, and that's how they say, I'm finished with my homework there. So resist the impulse to put English into right and wrong categories, because sometimes the things that we see as wrong are actually just a variety of English we haven't hit yet. Now, I know this is hard to do on the fly because I've tutored students before, and even one-on-one, I'm kind of like, right, wrong, right, wrong. But try and at least get right and wrong out of your vocabulary. Say, we don't say it that way, or no, did you hear it that way somewhere? Which brings me to myth 3. I know I'm flying through things, but I tend to fly through things. Myth 3 is that standard English is a construct. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the history of English, you will see that prior to about 1600, English was, as I said, about 200 dialects in a trench coat pretending to be a language. Prior to 1600, all those dialects were all totally fine. There was no dialect that was primary. There was no dialect that was the quote-unquote educated dialect. There was no standard. We didn't have one. So I love pulling out this example. This is Middle English. So that's English spoken from about 1100 to 1400-ish. Middle English, sort of smack in the middle of the big run up to modern English. These are all of the existing extant spellings for the word right that we have. And all of them are right, in that they are the word right, and they are also correct. There's no spelling there that is wrong. Now, as you can imagine, this means that Middle English is difficult to read, and it also mostly means that we went from this huge list of spellings of right to just one spelling. How did this happen? The way this happened was through the actual creation of what we now call Standard English. And there are 3 interlinked precipitating events that lead to it. So we're going to start in about 1600. The first thing that happens is we have England become a major trading superpower. This is the age of exploration or exploitation, depending on whether you were on the ship or off the ship. England becomes a big trading superpower. This means that English sailors, English merchants, are suddenly having communications and having to communicate with all sorts of different people that they haven't before. And English as a language begins to start pulling more and more and more foreign words into it. So we start pulling in Arabic words through contact with Spanish traders who are in Arabic-speaking regions. We start pulling in more Dutch words because the Dutch are sort of a main center for textile trade. We are now heading west to the quote-unquote New World, and we start bringing over their words, all of these indigenous language words for flora and fauna that are there that are not in England. And of course, we have the mid-Atlantic and transatlantic slave trade, which means that we're now in contact with Western and Northern African languages, and we've borrowed words from there, like banana and gumbo. English, starting in 1600 and running to 1750, doubles the size of its vocabulary. And the vast majority of those words are foreign words that we borrowed in. This also means we have more foreign speakers of English that are coming in. Now, because of exploration, we also have the creation of the middle class. Before this time, English society was really sort of socioeconomically stratified. You had peasants, and then you had merchant class. And they were all kind of low class, working class. Then you had the aristocracy way at the top. They were the ones who owned land, they had all the power. Because of all of these merchants making all of this money in trade, suddenly this working class population has a ton of money. And at the same time, for a bunch of other reasons, the aristocracy begins losing land. Land holding was the way that you had power and wealth. So these lower class merchants, some of whom were barely literate, some of whom could barely write, they might be able to sign their names, they might be math literate, numerically literate, they start buying land, which means that they've bought entry into the upper class. The other thing that's tied with landowning is education. Education was not universal, really, until about the 1800s. So you have these lower class people who are not quite literate. They don't quite know how to sort of navigate the idioms of the upper class. And they've now bought their way into the upper class. They are the middle class. Their speech is much lower register, and it is considered inelegant and vulgar. And because you have this new middle class and they want to emulate the speech of the upper class and they want to have the education of the upper class and they can now have it, you also have this hot new tech that's come into England called the printing press. Printing press comes into England in the late 1400s, but really printing books doesn't start taking off until the mid 1500s as the middle class emerges from trade. And now just about everyone can get a book. And when you have lots of books and increased literacy, and you've got all of these new foreign speakers coming in, all of these new foreign words coming in, you add all of that together, and the educated upper class yells that it's the death of English. This is what starts standard English. So what happens is you've got a bunch of educated men who are seeing all of these sort of incursions into English, and they decide, look, the English that I know is elegant, it's lovely, I want to keep writing poems in it. And so some of these really well-educated writers decide we're going to make English a record or a language of record. A language of record is something that obviously keeps records, but it has to have elegance. The idea of elegance was very important to them, and elegance meant purity. So what they did was they decided they're going to clean it up a little bit, clean up English, cut out some foreign stuff, codify some rules, and that is going to give us standard English. So I'd like to introduce you to John Dryden, who's really the father of what we think of as grammar today. Well-known writer of the 1600s, late 1500s, also the father of modern literary criticism. But for our purposes, the big thing you need to know about him is this is the guy that created the rule that says you can't end a sentence with a preposition. Why did he create that rule, and how dare I say he created it? Well, he did create it. He thought that English should be more like Latin. And in Latin, you can't end a sentence with a preposition because there really aren't any prepositions in Latin. So what John Dryden did was when he would write about other writers, he would note that, you know, Ben Jonson is a wonderful writer, but he has this very vulgar habit of ending sentences with prepositions. And in his own writing, he went through later in life when his books were released in a second edition and changed all of his terminal prepositions so they didn't show up. Now, the way that these things happen is you want to be the smartest person in the room, right? So other aspiring writers said, well, John Dryden says you can't end a sentence with a preposition, then you can't end a sentence with a preposition. And this is basically how all of these rules became codified. It's one person's sort of individual peeve or their opinion about what would make English elegant ends up being repeated and repeated and repeated until we think that this is how English works. And this is what standard English is. Why am I saying it's a construct? Clearly it's not. It's worked for a few hundred years. The problem is that standard English is a written dialect that is based on a Platonic ideal of language that never actually existed. Standard English was what we should all aspire to, and it was all based on writing. The problem is that writing is only a record of language. It is not language. So you have this problem where we say standard English is, you know, it's a standard. Standard means it's a benchmark. Benchmark means that this is what we should all aspire to. But it ignores the fact that A, language is primarily spoken, and B, that you can have a written dialect that has totally different rules than a spoken dialect. Now, what do you do with that? You can't just say, well, we're going to jettison standard English from here on out. You can't, but what you can do is when you talk to your students about standard English, call it a written dialect. It's standard written English, or it's formal written English. Don't say it's standard English. Absolutely do not say it is proper English. It is standard English, that's it. So, you know, I've also had teachers say, well, this is going to be confusing to my students to say all of these rules only apply to writing, but in speech there's a different set of rules. It's actually not that difficult. Lots of foreign languages actually have that. Arabic is a good example. There's modern written Arabic, and then there's a bunch of spoken dialects. So, standard English is a construct. It is a written dialect. And that will lead us into myth 4, which is that good grammar is a moving target. So before I dive into this, I want to highlight 3 ontological constants that are based on 25 years of experience as a student of language and a lexicographer. The first is that language changes. That is not an opinion, that is just a fact. The second is that if a language stops changing, it dies. The reason that no one speaks classical Latin anymore is because people stopped speaking classical Latin. And once you break that chain of transmission, it has to be a spoken chain of transmission, then that language stops moving. So classical Latin does not have a word for social media because no one speaks it. And now, if language changes and if a language stops changing, it dies. The third thing to hold in tension is that no one likes change. I cannot tell you how many thousands of emails I have answered over the years from people. Their basic complaint is that language changes. It does change. And because language changes, that means that our idea of what constitutes good and bad grammar also changes. The house is building. What is this? This is the way that prior to about 1850, we would talk about building a house. We wouldn't say the house is being built. We said the house is building. And in fact, grammarians of the time, William Wells being one of them, said that the house is building is not just, one way to say it, but it is, quote, the prevailing practice of the best authors. You'll see if you look at this quote that the house is being built is also in use, but he thinks that it's bad grammar. This is kind of how we handle grammar. We look at the quote unquote prevailing practice of the best authors, we sift them very heavily, and then we say this is what good grammar is. The reality is that the house is building is now completely ungrammatical to us. If your student said the house is building, you would say, no, the house is being built. That vulgar form that William Wells didn't like prevailed. That's just how it goes. You can have strong feelings about it or not. There it is. Now, you may say, well, yeah, we know that these things can change. If good grammar can change, so can bad grammar. Do not use they as a singular pronoun. Now, I don't know about you guys. I grew up in an era where you were not allowed to use they as a singular pronoun. You used he as the singular third person pronoun, or singular gender neutral third person pronoun. I was right on the cusp of he or she. Still sounds kind of clunky to me, but you still see, particularly, sort of people who champion language saying, no, can't use they as a singular pronoun. It's plural only. It's ungrammatical. What makes it ungrammatical? Because the singular they has been in written use since 1350, give or take. The date of the manuscript is not quite nailed down. It's also been in consistent written use and was until the mid-1800s when the gender-neutral he was proposed as an alternative and adopted. Please note, it was proposed. We didn't just default to the gender-neutral he. Someone said we should do it. Also, there were about 24 other potential gender-neutral pronouns that we were all kind of batting around and suggesting. So really, until the mid-1800s, they was a singular pronoun. So from the mid-1800s on, we should use gender-neutral he, and everyone stopped using they. Just kidding, everyone kept using they. Now they just felt really bad about using they because everyone kept telling him that they were using bad grammar. If it's been around for 700 years, is it bad grammar? Is it ungrammatical? No. You can have a personal antipathy against singular they. You can think it's ugly. You can think that it is the crack in the foundation of English and will tear the whole thing down. That's your right. You can think that. But you can't say it's ungrammatical. Grammar eventually caught up. So I am an editor. I pay attention to style guides. Every major American style guide now allows for the use of singular they. Even the really sort of, linguistically conservative ones. Brian Garner, who's a prescriptivist, says you can use singular they. Bonus, singular they older than the singular you. So if you're going to have someone peeve against the singular they also better be using thee and thou instead of you. Now, okay, these are like fun little factoids, but if moving grammar is a good target and standard English is just a construct, how does that help our students? It actually is empowering to hear from a native speaker that language changes and that can explain some of the inconsistencies that they will inevitably run into. If you have a student say, I hear they as singular all the time, you can explain. Some people don't like it. They think it's not grammatical, but it is. It's hard to learn a language when that language is presented to you as just sort of this unmoving, totally unshapable thing. Language is about interaction. Which brings me to myth 5, and that is that English is English. This gets back to some of the peeves of the grammarians of standard English, but you hear this a lot, right? Like, well, karaoke is a foreign word. It's not an English word, and you really want to learn English. So you should abandon Spanglish, or you should abandon whatever, pidgin you speak in at home. You should just English immersion. And there are definitely reasons to do that. But the idea that the English language itself has been sort of this intact and inviolate thing since time immemorial is absolutely wrong. In fact, from the very beginning, we've had problems. So these are the days of the week. We have Sunday and Monday from the Saxon words sonnen and monen, sun and moon. Sonnendag, Monendag, Sunday, Monday. Saxon, Germanic. Awesome. Tuesday for the Norse god of war, Tu. Wednesday for the Norse god, sort of all-father god. Thursday for Chris Hemsworth. Friesday for Freya, the goddess of fertility. All of those Norse. They are not Saxon, they're not Germanic, they are Nordic. And then we have Saturn Day. Saturn Day uses Saturn, which is the name of a Roman god, completely out of the pantheon. All 7 of these words, well attested before 900 AD. So English has been kind of a big mess from the get-go. The idea that English is sort of unshaped by foreign influence is not new. These are 2 quotes I love because they're just ridiculous. Ranulph Higden in 1387 complained that English was dying because it was mixing with Danish and then with Norman French. And then the country's language became harmed and used some strange gabbling, chattering, snarling, and harsh teeth gnashing. In the Middle English translation, it uses strange laughing, chittering, hirning, and grit-gribinding. So you tell me which sounds stranger and more harsh than this. But Ranulph Higden was absolutely incensed that English was being polluted by the Danes and the French. 100 years later, William Caxton, who was the first printer in England, first English printer in England, complained in the preface to Enedios that the language, it's the perpetual language today. When I was a kid, we used language properly. And he says, in these days, every man is going to say the things, utter his communications and matters in such ways and using such terms that few men will understand them. He's not saying that formally English is changing because we know it moves from Middle English to Modern English. He's complaining that the English of his youth is gone. These complaints are not new. They have been around for 1,000 years. And lo, English is still here. We're still okay. This leads me to the core myth that we need to bust. And this is the one that is the most important for your students. And that is that my English is the best English. Native speakers act as if the English that they speak is the only English there is, and that their English is the standard, right? It's kind of like if you are in the middle of a crowded room and you look around, you're like, I'm the center of everything, because you are physically the center of everything. But that doesn't mean that you actually are. I said at the beginning, English is not this big monolithic thing. When we talk about English to our students, I like to use the analogy of a river. So when you look at a river, it looks like one thing that's moving in one direction, but it's actually made up of hundreds of different currents. Each of those currents is a different dialect of English. And those currents move at different rates. Some of them are on the bottom of the river, some of them are on the top. Some of those currents move counter to the direction of the river. And you can't see the individual currents, but if you take away one current, or if you change one current significantly, it alters the whole direction of the river. That's what English is. Every variety of English makes up English. Without all the varieties, then it's not English. And that includes the English that is created and is struggled with by English language learners. What do I mean? I'm going to talk about prepone. Prepone is one of my favorite new words. Prepone means to move an event to a time prior than its scheduled time, right? So you're rescheduling ahead of time. It's beautiful, right? It's based on postpone, so it takes postpone apart, puts the pre on, beautiful word. Prepone originates from Indian business English. It is not native to the States, to the UK, to any of the places where English is spoken. It is specifically Indian business English. That means that Indian English speakers, most of whom have learned English as a foreign language, sat down, said, okay, when we move meetings, if we say we're moving up, does that mean it's later or earlier? If we're moving back, how's it go? They realized that we had a word in English, postpone, and they said, let's create a new one based on it, prepone. This is beautiful. It understands the morphology of English beautifully. You know what else? It's so good that it is now being re-exported out to the States, and it's being re-exported out to the UK. Prepone is now showing up in the lands where English has been for much longer than in India. And that's what's happening. Global Englishes, the Englishes that are encountered by your students, that are sort of in your students' atmospheres at home, that English is what's driving English forward. Those sorts of new things, because that's how language grows. It grows from the transmission of old speakers to new speakers. And this is how we do it. Dr. Ann Charity Hudley is a linguist who studies varieties of English in the classroom. And I just listened to a talk she did on Duolingo. And she spoke to the heart of this. She said, your language is not broken, nor are you. Right? We hear a lot of times, and we don't use it, but the culture does, people talking about broken English. Learners speak in broken English. Their language is not broken, nor are they. Your students are linguistic superheroes, right? We went over that. They're more aware of social shifts and change in context than native speakers are. They're much more attuned to inflectional changes and to nonverbal cues. They make connections between languages that monolingual native speakers cannot make, cannot make. These are the people, your students are the ones who are going to be moving English forward. So when they say they want to learn English, help them to sort of sit in the English that they're in right now. Yes, we all aspire to fluency, absolutely. But what we want to do is we want to encourage them where they are. So we need to encourage our students to remind them that all types of English matter, that every speaker of English matters, and that they matter to English because they will be the future of English. And that's it. I think I probably went over. No, not quite.
No, that's just about perfect. We do have a few minutes if anyone has a question. I have to say, I didn't know that singular they is older than singular you. That's definitely something I'm going to be talking about.
It is.
I think the chat window is mostly just accolades and everyone saying thank you so much and I love this. This was, I have to say, a great way to end our conference as well. Thank you for the energy and thank you for attending. We do have, for everyone else, we do have our celebration afterwards, and Kory, you're invited as well.
Oh, thank you.
And it'll just be in the same room, guys. Thank you so much. Can we clap emoji? Thank you very much.